Welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This week we are talking about all things meetings. What makes a good one? How many do you have that literally shouldn't exist? And how often do you show up for a meeting without really knowing what you're there for? Join us as we explore how we can take better control of our schedules and help others to do the same in this episode on being in meetings. Hello, Bridge.
Hi, Bobby. How are you?
I'm sort of well.
Stressed with tech.
One of the most angsty things about meetings now in this day and age, when tech doesn't work and you are meant to be participating well in a meeting or not, which up until this point this afternoon has been quite tricky. But we're here now.
Yeah, I had a Zoom call the other day for a speaking engagement that I was going to do and couldn't for the life of me get my mic to work. And, I tried my laptop. I then tried to join the meeting on my tablet, and then I tried to join it on my phone. I just couldn't I tried another set of headphones, and I was just like, they must think I'm a complete idiot, because it was the first time I'd met them. And then they just said, hey, we feel your pain. They were saying how many Zoom meetings they do a week, and that just every single time there was at least one person just going, can you hear me? Can you hear me? And it just, it's that sort of Zoom thing, or you're on mute or whatever, is I think is just an added burden when you've already got a kind of a burden of X number of meetings a week.
Yeah, one of the first things I wrote down when I was writing notes for this was most meetings are sufferings. It often feels like that because of all of the other claggage you have around it, let alone, as we were saying in the intro, showing up for something and not really being sure what the hell you're doing there, which is as much our own responsibility as it is others. But I think that one of the ways that I was thinking about getting into all of this is that I think that meetings is so habitual and like a real habit. And the number of organisations that I work in, when I say, why do you have the meetings in this order? Why haven't you got so-and-so at it? Why do you have it on this day of the week? Why do you have it at this time? Why do you have it at all? And more often than not, to the majority of my why questions are to the tune of, oh, it's because we've always done it like that. Or we haven't really reflected on whether we should be doing anything different or not. And so what happens is people's schedules stay exactly the same, even if the organisation has moved on or it's doing something different or there's new people involved. It's back a little bit to our re-induct when you've got new members of the team. But, a good old meeting audit every now and again isn't a bad idea, just to see if it's all fitting together correctly. And, what is a meeting? We use the term very liberally, and more often than not, or frequently, I find that I may be in a meeting that could have been a telephone call or a quick Teams message or whatever it might be. But people have got into this habit of, let's call a meeting.
Yeah, I had a look at HBR. They've got an article called Stop Wasting Valuable Time. And that was talking about how, in a way, we've got lazy in terms of meetings. You have a meeting, but why? Why are we having the meeting? What's the purpose? Everyone's busy. And their point was, actually, for senior execs, most of your meetings really should be focused on strategy and decision making. And they end up having lots of meetings, but really only about maybe 3 hours a month where they actually achieve that of talking about strategy or having decisions made. The rest is wasted on, we had the meeting to share information. We had the meeting just to, and it went down a sidetrack of something that isn't a priority. And it was really interesting to just sort of have that thought. So, actually, the number of meetings I've been to where I just didn't really need to be there, or someone could have sent me the minutes or could have sent me a document, just said, just for your information, this is what's happening. If you need to discuss further, then get in touch with this contact person. But your point, actually, I really like that it's actually, we spend a lot of time blaming the other person, the other enditis. It's, oh God, they just called all these meetings. It's just so ridiculous. But we don't do anything about it because, and so it just continues in that circle rather than contacting the person and say, do I need to be there? What's the purpose? Can I see the documents? I need the documents X number of days before the meeting, rather than just sort of running along with it and then sitting there twiddling on emails or just sighing and complaining about management. I think it's really a really good point that if you don't think you should be at the meeting or you're not getting the information you need, then speak up.
I completely agree. And I think that I've been in organisations where people think that I've been quite obstreperous. Oh, I love that word, especially when it's being used on me. But I never was meaning to be. So it was more of an education. So, let's start right from the top with the subject matter that they give to the meeting. Half of the time I'd be like, what the friggin' hell are we meant to be discussing at this? So not doing what it says on the tin. And then, and we can come on to this about when you need an agenda and when don't you, and when do you need minutes, etc., because some of that is bureaucratic baloney and sometimes it's really necessary. So I'll come back to that. But it would be a case of, well, what is it that you are actually discussing at the meeting? What is it that you aim to achieve at the meeting, which goes to your point about when senior management should be talking about strategy, etc. And if it's not that, what is it? And what am I needed for? And often I'd go, okay, that's likely to be 15 minutes, not the 2 hours that you've slammed into my diary. So tell me which 15 minutes to show up for. And then the obstreperous bit came that if I got no response, I didn't show up, which might seem rather awkward, but I only had to do it once or twice before they said, no, we really needed you at the meeting. I said, well, you probably did, but you didn't explain to me what I was doing there. And I think that, the other word I would actually use here, rather than obstreperous, is respectful. Being respectful of each other's times. And my other question often is why does every meeting have to be an hour? Again, it's habitual. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to question these things. If things aren't working as well as they should do, or people are in absolute meeting fatigue.
Yeah, and I actually think that there's rarely a need to have a meeting over an hour unless you're having some kind of workshop. And back-to-back meetings are also an issue. I know that, I think maybe we've discussed this before, but it was one of the first things that was brought up during the pandemic when I was still working for the UN, and they started having these leadership workshops or short half an hour trainings on how to manage remotely. And one of the first things, it was probably the most useful thing that came out of all of those trainings, really, someone who was very practical just said, look, don't have hour-long meetings, have 50-minute meetings, because if people are going to be doing back-to-back meetings now because we're working fully remotely, then people need to be able to go and have a pee or go and make a cup of tea or, let the dog out or, whatever it is, go and eat something so that people don't go into diabetic comas. So I really do think that this respect for time covers so many aspects of meetings. And actually the other one is turning up on time. I used to really get annoyed by, you'd arrive on time for the meeting, it wouldn't start for 10 minutes because they'd be going, oh, we're just waiting for some people to come. And then we'd start, and then maybe another 10 minutes into the meeting, so 20 minutes late, someone would come in and then take over by being the drama queen of, oh yeah, I'm so sorry, I'm late. Oh, there was this and there was that. And I'm so, effectively, I'm so important that I can come in late, but also I'm so important that I can actually now disrupt it for another 10 minutes while you listen, and they go around and say hello to everyone.
And then
that used to really bug me.
And then they reiterate what they've missed.
So you just start again.
I don't need to bloody hear it a second time. It's your responsibility to find out what's already gone on. Honestly, yeah. There were the moments of rocking in my seat. I agree with you. I did get to the point with the virtual meeting malarkey during COVID of wondering whether I should just actually install a commode in my office and have done with it. Because the back-to-backs. But, it's silly things like the system can actually, if you set up, I can't remember, is it Teams? Oh, one of the horrific systems that we use. But you can set it up so that when you actually schedule time in your diary, if you put in an hour-long meeting, it'll do it for 55 minutes.
Great, yeah.
Not that, again, anyone took much notice of it, mea culpa, including myself, so there is a level of self-responsibility. I mean, I just did an audit on mine recently to realise what a mess I'd created of mine all by myself now that I'm self-employed. So I have no one to point a finger at other than myself with regards to that. But I do think the gentle challenge, and if necessary, the slightly more direct challenge every now and again with quite what people are doing to your diary, or the ability to just shove something in because they can see that it's a space and not take any account that you've got something before and after. I think those sort of things need to get called out.
Yeah. And the other thing, I always used to be incredibly grateful to the chair of meetings who actually did take cognizance of respect for people's time, so that the chair who would start on time regardless of who was there, and also kept people to the hour. I was always really impressed, and I felt that they were respecting me by doing that they would keep people on track, they would keep people to the agenda, they would, they'd identified what the priority discussions were, they would park things. So I've seen that one of the sort of a technique for keeping meetings on time is to have a parking lot, to just say, okay, we're going to park that, or to say, we're going to take that offline, that, further discussion on this doesn't need to involve everybody here. So again, that sort of, I'm respecting the people around this table or who are attending the meeting, and sort of allocating time, saying, we've got 5 minutes to discuss this point. And then people will be like, oh, well, I haven't seen the papers. And I say, well, then you'll have to go and read it some other time, because we've got 5 minutes to discuss this. So I've had a couple of chairs of meetings who were really, really good about that, and then would wrap it up. You get to 55 minutes and then we'd be going, right, we're wrapping up, and people are like, oh, but I've got we've just stick in an agenda for another time, or you can do it bilaterally, whatever it is, or asynchronously, but we will be finishing at whatever time it is, because I have other stuff to do and I'm sure everyone else does. I was always really appreciative of that.
No, I agree. I think the point that point that you're making there about, and another thing, a couple of organisations I've worked in where agendas were part and parcel of whatever type of meeting that you were having, where we took AOB, any other business, off the agenda, because in my mind, and thankfully in the mind of the chair, was that any other business was often an ill-prepared piece that somebody wanted to lob in at the end. So it came off. So if you hadn't done your preparation, fielded the papers, done the discussions, had it added to the agenda, and saying how much time was needed to it, because that was the other thing that we gave people responsibility for. What time do you need for discussion on this? Is it for discussion? Is it for information? Whatever it might be. So AOB was taken off.
I like that. I really like that. And I've come across it recently because I've just taken over as a board member for a charity, and I did a whole load of the governance training with an organisation called Board Match Ireland, who were training up people to take on board membership. And they said exactly the same thing, that AOB is not something that should be on an agenda.
It means nothing. And I think it brings to the point as well about that I haven't seen the papers. Those types of meetings where preparation is non-negotiable. So I've also been, involved in board meetings, etc., where you find that you get this massively hefty paper from somewhere in the organisation. And you say, why have you given them all of that? So there's a number of reasons. Covering your arse. So you're just putting all of that together. That you're not really thinking about the audience very well. And so many organisations I've worked in where you should be streamlining the board papers because there is no way that they are going to read it. But that then becomes a double-edged sword because you think they're not going to read it, so then you need more time to explain it all to them in the meeting. So then the meeting gets longer. So nobody's doing the right level of information. So it's almost like whatever it is that you're actually creating, first and foremost, requires a discussion. So you need probably a shorter paper, but time for discussion so that you can find out all of the questions that the board might have. So you're seeding an idea. That's a very different type of meeting to, I'm now bringing you a paper where I've gone and researched and done all you've asked me to do from the discussion. And now I have a paper with a set of recommendations in it. Now, at that point, my view is that the board members, it's a non-negotiable that they should have read that paper and understood what's been asked of them. And if it's a case of that they are asking questions in those meetings, which has happened to me on far too many occasions, that is there in the paper, they actually shoot themselves in the foot because you haven't read it then. And again, a slight level of cussedness, but I'd go, it was in the paper, page 7, paragraph 17, or whatever it might be. Because you should, at that time, to curtail and respect people's time, been able to get to what are the decisions we're making on the recommendations because everybody's read it.
Yeah, and also we had that discussion during our training, and one of the things that they said was, that's a point where the chair should be having a discussion with that board member to say, and obviously, you're going to come back and say, well, and it was the chair, because it's also disrespectful to all the other board members as well as
Agreed.
It's disrespectful of everyone's time because, and I think that that's the issue, isn't it? That when you're wasting time, if other people are involved, then you're disrespecting that time. And so I've been quite interested. It went down a little rabbit hole on sort of different types of meetings, in a way, following on from what you're saying about different ways of having meetings and, particularly this issue of what the corporate world, I think, describes as asynchronous communication, which is about, a meeting actually takes quite a lot of preparing to make it efficient and effective. It's a bit like that quote about, I was going to write you a short letter, but I didn't have the time. To focus, to make sure that people have got the papers, to agree as to the purpose of the meeting, to maybe have some bilateral or other discussions that are going to feed into that meeting. And then also afterwards do follow-up, in terms of, because not every meeting is going to have a final decision, but it might have some action points that need to follow on. And so that 50 minutes of the meeting where everyone's together may involve different groups of people doing other work outside of that period.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe is something that we often forget. You just are like, yeah, whatever. Okay, I'm going to go and sit in this 50-minute meeting, play whatever it is game on my phone because I don't know why I'm there or I think it's a waste of time. And then that's it. And then I can bitch and moan about it for another week. So I had a little look at different ideas. And I wonder if you've ever come across them, because certainly lots of them I had to sort of Google and look up.
So you go first, because I also found a rabbit hole of a similar ilk. I think I've mentioned him to you before, a guy that I've been on courses with called Richard Watkins. He also does a taxonomy of meetings and sort of like the archetypical type. So let's see, as you go, if I can correlate it with the 6 that he comes up with.
Okay, perfect. So AI helped me with this list. Right. So thank you, AI. So stand-up meetings. So I think is the aim to keep so that people don't bang on too long. And they're aimed at sort of short meetings. Fishbowl conversations. Now, so this one I did have to Google. And when I looked at it, I was thinking, actually, that's quite a clever idea. A bit like how much of this meeting do I have to be here for, is where they have a centre group and then there's sort of concentric circles of chairs around, and there's some spare chairs in the sort of centre group, and the initial speakers, whether they're subject matter experts or the sort of the activity holder, give a little brief on whatever it is the purpose of the meeting, and then once they've finished, they may go and sit on the circle a little bit further out, and other people who feel that they should be contributing come in, and then they move out once they've finished their little bit, and so people are sort of popping in and out to the centre circle where they're talking. I don't know if you've ever come across that.
What I'm sitting here smiling about, we had a session very early doors in our first season with Steve White, didn't we? Who I worked with in housing. Now, it was before his arrival, but I had been made the HR director, but the board said I wasn't required at the board meetings, even though I was a member of the senior management team. So they took a number of the senior management team to the board meeting, but not myself or the marketing director. So when we complained about this, we were then told that we could come and sit in the meetings on a chair by the wall. I felt like saying, do you want me to wear a frigging dunce's cap as well if you put me in the corner? But I was to be seen and not heard. So I don't think that quite correlates with the fishbowl conversation. But of course, what happened was that you could see them getting themselves into a right pickle over some people issue or something to do with an HR strategy. And so eventually they had to call upon me when I was allowed to speak. But it was from the wall, not coming into the circle. So, it was an interesting organisation, to say the least. But it sort of correlates for me, and we'll come to Rich's list rather than us trying to make direct comparisons. But what that speaks to is having the right people in the conversation. How many times, because I know it's many for me, but probably the same for you, that you end up in a meeting and a whole load of assumptions are being made about something because you haven't got the right people in the room. And I just want to say to people sometimes, look, let's just stop this. Either call them, park it, as you said it, but that type of fishbowl conversation feels excellent to me if you can set that up correctly, because what you're doing is so many things. One, you get the subject matter expert to be in the conversation if they're needed, but equally, those people on the outside circles are also hearing all of the context, the organisational context of a whole host of other things. It's a development opportunity for the people that are there as well. There's so much to that. And it's certainly a very different setup to the one that I've just alluded to with be seen and not heard, because as you can imagine, that was quite tricky for me. But I really like that idea, but it's not one that I've seen wholly in practice, I don't think. But I'm thinking of all sorts of places where it could get used. I think maybe I've seen it where it's been more extrapolated out, like stop the convo because you haven't got the right people in the room. That needs a working party or whatever it might be to take things further forward. But actually doing that all in a one like that, I think sounds pretty cool.
So next one was one called open space technology. And so there were maybe three that for me sounded kind of overlapped or sounded similar. They obviously had some differences. So open space technology, World Cafe, and lean coffee. So there's a bit of a coffee thing going on there. And these are sort of much more, they seem a little bit more chaotic. I think the open space technology one, as far as I understood, was sort of everyone is being invited for their expertise, and then effectively they rely on people to sort of generate the agenda themselves by everyone sort of talking and deciding what topics they're going to focus on. And it sort of goes, I guess, maybe like a bit like a wave, sort of interest comes and goes and people move on to different things. So I think it just sounded a bit difficult to manage. I didn't have time to look at it too much, but it just did sound a little bit crazy. The World Cafe is set up in like a cafe, so with tables and small groups, and each table has a question or a topic that they are going to discuss, and then they rotate out. So once there's a time frame, they discuss the topic, they then move out, but there's usually one person who stays on the table with the question to then gather all the information and then collate it and summarize it at the end of the World Cafe. And then the lean coffee sounds very democratic, where again, everyone comes along and puts in topics that they'd like to discuss, and then they vote on them. The top 5 go onto the agenda, and then they start with the first one, and they're given a particular time, whether that's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, to discuss that topic. And then they get a Roman thumbs up or thumbs down as to whether or not they want to continue after the time frame has gone. If the thumbs down, they move on to the next one. If it's thumbs up, then they continue talking for another time slot and do the same. So they basically work through the topics in that way. But actually, one of my favourite was silent meetings, which I thought were brilliant. Which
sounds horrible.
They use. So silent meetings are effectively, I mean, it does, in a way, it keeps it on track. So you've been given all the papers for the topics or whatever you need, and then you are given a period of time to silently consider. And I think they use, collaborative tech to sort of write post-it notes or whatever their thoughts are on the topic, and then they're collated, and then there is sort of a summing up session at the end. I don't know, it's necessarily a very good session for making decisions, but it might be, a lot of these ideas come from design thinking. So, doing design sprints and things like that to try and brainstorm or get ideas. But yeah, and then the final one was virtual reality meetings, which sounded weird and expensive. So yeah, it was all about effectively having a remote meeting, but somehow they make you feel like you're actually sat next to someone. I guess you'd have to wear some kind of suit.
I thought you could turn up as one of the Marvel characters or something because you're in a virtual.
Well, maybe you could.
You're in a virtual reality. Or
I'm my cat.
It'd be perfectly all right then to say I am a cat rather than I'm not a cat. Oh my God, the mind boggles. Don't send me down that track. Honestly, it's been one of those days. So what of those have I seen? So open space technology sounds a bit to me like a more appropriate version of brainstorming, but using technology potentially, like a Miro board or whatever it might be, which I have been involved in. The World Cafe piece is actually one of my favourites when I'm running team development days and management development days. So that it's almost like speed coaching circles, where you're giving them the topics, and as you're rightly saying, and then somebody stays on, and then they add to, and then they move again, and somebody else adds to, and then somebody has to summarize back. I use that a lot. It's really effective, really effective. It's probably a bit of a combination where we're saying that whilst the fishbowl conversation element, that concentric circle thing hasn't gone on, I have often encouraged organisations, SMTs, senior management teams, to allow their heads of department to deal or discuss some of the gnarly issues that the senior management team are trying to fathom, just to see what they come up with, and then bring that back. So it sort of enriches the conversation and it helps their development as well. So the World Cafe one I love. Interestingly, at one of the organisations I worked at, we did talk about the silent meetings, so that we took all of the papers that had been written for board as a senior management team and read all of them together silently. It wasn't using the Miro or anything. We had a conversation at the end of it to sort of support each other with the types of key headlines that we should actually be presenting to the board rather than regurgitating the papers. So here are the key headlines. Nice. This is what we want from you on it, whatever it might be, and add other things in that, it might have been worthwhile because I think so-and-so is going to say X because of, the things that you know about the different board members that you could stave off in your opening comments. So I have used a number of them, in fact, as a result. But I didn't know that they had all of those fancy names.
Yeah, me neither. The other one, and again, I wondered so daily huddle, I found that.
Yeah.
So huddle meetings, or actually walking meetings as well, which is kind of another version of the stand-up meeting. But daily huddles, what's that?
So with a daily huddle, and again, it probably has different versions to it, but especially during COVID, my team and I would huddle on a daily basis, almost to just talk about the 3 key things they were going to do that day. And I think we've talked about this a little bit before, that often what happens in organisations is that they've got these very ostentatious annual plans. But how do you then track back that you're going to achieve the goals that you set out at the end of the year? You know, what's it going to look like after each quarter? What's it going to look like after each month? What's it going to look like after each week? What's it going to look like after each day? And it's like with anything, you know, when you get to the end of the day, have achieved the things that you set out to achieve. And it's that sort of habit forming for me. So there is the, what are you doing today, and how does it enable the longer term objectives? And it may well be that you're not looking at the annual ones, then you might be looking at the month or the week. But it's just that pulling it back so that everybody stays motivated, because it seems achievable. Whereas in a way, you know, an annual objective can often feel very ethereal, and how the hell am I going to do this?
Yeah.
So it's taking the time to do that, I think.
Did you ever come across organisations that have an agreed day where there will be no meetings, or a week where there will be no meetings? Because that was something else I came across as I was like scooting down my little rabbit hole.
I haven't, but I think in sort of like reverse of that, things like away days, so that you're making sure that there is reflection time put in for senior management teams. And this is where we're back to what's the definition of a meeting. So we may well be taking particular gnarly topics that we want to talk about at an away day, but you take yourself away. So you steer clear of your emails, you steer clear of phone conversations, you steer clear of any other meetings. You know, it is a day that is sacrosanct, because you are reflecting, or you're doing that strategic work that you want to do to make sure that you're keeping yourself on track. So I've seen those sort of like elements to it, and I've always strongly encouraged organisations and teams to have that away time. It's not downtime. You don't necessarily have to be off bowling together or anything like that. You know, it's still work, but it's a new environment. It may well have particular things that you want to discuss, but it's not necessarily an agenda or with minutes. It's a different style of meeting, which goes back to this taxonomy that I'm going to say a little about, that there's different types, but it's almost like getting better at what is the type of meeting that I'm having. What's the flavour to it? How long does it need to be? Where does it need to be? Does it need an agenda? Does it need writing up afterwards? You know, all of those things, because otherwise you spend your whole time in a cottage industry of minutes and paperwork rather than doing.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And so let's hear the taxonomy.
So, Mr. Watkins, thank you for this. I love this, and I will definitely put this in the resources afterwards, because I think that this is what could help organisations, and I have used it to help organisations about what is it that you're actually really doing. Have you got your meeting construct right, and does it actually really need to be one? So here it goes. So this is where my question about does it need an agenda or not comes from, because I think it does depend on the format, and that's what Rich points to in this taxonomy. So the first one he talks about is a broadcast. So that's, you know, some people call it a town hall, some people call it just an announcing side of things, but it's informative. It's probably got quite a large audience. It may well be that it's just the chief exec or the senior management team. But some of the things he says is, for God's sake, please don't make it death by PowerPoint. It's got to be key pointers. The speakers need to be really well prepared in what they actually want to say, and very engaging, because you've probably got a lot of the organisation listening into it somehow or another, and attempting to find meaningful opportunities to interact. Now, that's tricky. That depends on how big the group is. But again, depending on whether it's mutual or face-to-face, this is the sort of thing where you can actually use voting polls or people being able to ask questions, etc., etc. It's a great way of getting good information out to make sure that everyone's linked into what an organisation is doing. So I quite like that one. So the second one, and I think this has popped up in different formats as we've been talking, but it's the rhythm meeting. So this is your structured, regular team meeting, which should be the one keeping momentum going towards your defined goals. It's solid. It's a time boxed agenda. Some of the things that you were talking about the very good chair, and I've seen this done in different ways. So there's the huddles that you've described where everybody gets 5 minutes, whatever it might be, just to say what those elements are. That's more of just a daily one. If this was sort of like your monthly team meeting, weekly team meeting, I'd say that has a set agenda. And the thing that often happens is that you have the set agenda, and then something will crop up, and you could end up down a rabbit hole or getting into a lot of detail. And what's required then is the discipline of no, that needs more time for discussion. It probably needs other people in the room. We need to take that offline so that you don't disintegrate the time boxed agenda of the rhythm meeting. So that was the second one. Third one is the working session. So that's almost the thing that we're saying that comes out of it. Oh no, we need to get into that. We need to get into that more. So you're then having a very specific meeting about a topic that's cropped up potentially in your rhythm monthly meeting. So it is something very specific. It is about moving something forward. It stops the rhythm meeting from meandering. Say it was the senior management team who'd come by it. It might not necessarily need all of the senior management team there, but it might need some of the subject matter experts in to move it forward. And that's the sort of meeting where you need to be really clear on the output that you're actually looking for, and that should have the action list at least from it, if not a decision as a result of it. So that's not necessarily agendaed in my book, I don't think. So then the fourth one is exploration. So that's more workshoppy, your learning action sets, your coaching circles. I think I'd probably put that in line with what you were talking about around fishbowl conversations and the World Cafe, and maybe even the lean coffee. So I think those are ways of being in exploration. And again, this is my bag. This is my absolute jam. This is why I didn't want to be working in an organisation anymore, because I want to be in exploration with organisations to help them think differently, work differently, whatever it might be. And so this is where you definitely want the right people in the room. You want a diverse set of voices. You're not rushing to answers or solutioneering, but a lot more questioning and significantly active listening. So this is where I work often when I call them coaching circles. But what you're doing in coaching circles is that you are bringing gnarly business issues to discuss together. But what you're not looking for with this 5, 7, however many people you've got in a group to be going, oh, well, when it happened to me, this is what I did. Because it's not the same situation. What you want to be in is that questioning mode of what have you tried so far? Who have you spoken to? What support are you getting? What are you learning as you go along? So that you keep the person who has the issue in that reflective thinking mode. So that's what a coaching circle looks like. You extrapolate any of that out in those ways that we've talked about with those different ideas with the World Cafe and what have you. That's what you want to be in. If you're in exploration, you're not closing things off. It can be outlandish. It can be through play that we've talked about before. There's a whole host of ways into it, but so much gets learned in those sort of like elements. And I think it's the one that is so often missing in organisations because they get themselves into this habit of structure.
I'm going to just interject on this one because I think this is maybe the time to talk about it. Is there's also an issue in meetings, before we move on to the final one, about how people speak, who gets to speak, how often they get to speak, who gets interrupted, that sort of inclusivity. And, you know, when we're talking about this particular phase where diversity of thought is so important, that actually being able to pay attention or be aware of of whether or not everyone is having a voice, or whether some voices are louder than others, is really important. And I came across a guy called Ken Barton. He spoke on a panel that I was on about a year ago now. And he has developed an app that provides real-time feedback and data-driven insights to understand who's getting to speak more. It's called Gender Fitness, the app, but I'm sure it can be tailored for all types of inclusivity. But it just is supposed to help, I think, for people to just go, oh, because often if you say, oh, that person always gets to speak and that person never does, people go, no, that's not, oh, I don't notice that, nobody, blah, blah, blah. But actually, if you've got the data, it can be really shocking sometimes for people to go, oh, God, yeah, God, I never realized that. And when I just had a little dig around, I found that there's a number of other apps that maybe don't do quite the same thing as Ken Barton's, but do a similar sort of thing. There's one called the Gender Timer that monitors man-interrupting. There's one called equaltime.io, which, again, does an analysis of who's speaking more than others. And then there's a couple with the UN that look at authority levels, who, whether or not people with more power or more authority are speaking, and therefore the people with less power are being silent. And they basically track who speaks for how long. It's called the G app. And then there's the UN REDD. I'm not entirely sure what they do. I might have to look that up. But they, again, do analysis of who's speaking and how often and for how long. So I just thought that's I've never come across places that actually use these, but I do think it's potentially quite a useful tool for people just to understand, if they think they're being inclusive, whether or not they actually are.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that from a leader perspective, look, not everyone has facilitation skills, but I do believe that leaders, if they feel that they are wanting in that area, I would encourage them strongly to get more. And it makes me think about that 50 minutes in a meeting, what's actually happened to get to that 50 minutes in a meeting with the papers or whatever it might be. So if we go back to this exploration piece, and I think this is why I love them so much as well, because you are ensuring that more people get heard. And I guess, if I'm being honest, in the first instance, I may well have looked at this initially around introvert and extrovert. Who are the people who are always piping up? Who are the people who will always, when you ask for volunteers to actually present back, actually doing it, whatever it might be? Who's taking the lead on tables? So I've often been in organisations and said, right, talk to me about how we're going to cut the smaller group. And organisations often say, oh, it doesn't matter, just stick them in, do it alphabetically, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, whatever it might be. And I would spend a lot of time making sure, it's a bit like your table plans, you don't just fling it all together for a wedding or an event, or when you're trying to get relationships built. So why the hell would you do anything differently when you're doing an exploration like this to make sure that you're making the best? Sometimes I've done it about, right, let's stick all of the extroverts together and see who shouts loudest, and make space for the introverts, having a very quiet table. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it. But again, you need to be thinking about, what is it that I want to get to, but what is it that I want to make sure of, to ensure that I'm hearing from everybody. And again, from a leader facilitator perspective, I firmly believe that you should be aware when people are being quiet. And however you do it, which is right for the individual, sound them out. It may well be, I'm wondering what you think about in this meeting, but if you know that they'll die 1,000 deaths because they don't want to speak in a public arena, you should take the time to speak to them afterwards. So I agree with you that apps to do the analysis, but I also want human beings to be watchful and mindful, and if they need to learn more, have people in who can do it for them.
Yeah, I agree, because there are elements of unconscious bias where, the leader is just used to hearing male voices, and so doesn't realise that actually that there's more male voices than female voices, or there's more European voices than non-European voices, or is just used to hearing X speaking, or not used to hearing the people who are more junior speaking, and it just doesn't even register. And I completely agree that they should be aware. But I do think that it often comes out when they have external facilitators, because the external facilitator will be equipped to
Yes.
manage that better. I think the apps are just there to flag things, to go, oh God.
It's giving them the
Wow.
data. It's giving them the data, because the data can't lie. Even when they think that they're doing a particular thing, and if it's not for themselves, to get them equipped with someone who can do that. Gatherings are most effective when you hear from the widest set of voices. The ones that I've been in where I've just felt joyful afterwards, because whilst they may well have come to the same conclusions as the senior management team, there's nothing I like better than going back and going, your heads of department have done this. Your heads of department have done this from scratch. They've done it together. They've worked cohesively. You are all on the same page. Use them better. Use them more, because they can help you. They'll only get the opportunity to do that the more that you make the space for these gatherings. So I
like that.
Speak for hours just on that one. So the exploration phases are a lot. The gatherings, equally important, I think, in terms of the relationship building, the connection, making sure that there's alignment between different departments. Again, organisations I've had to go and work with who want me to break down barriers, the silos. We've done an episode on that. But it is giving opportunities for this conversation. And what Rich says, and rightly so, is that this isn't another form of broadcast. This is them having the time to talk, lots of space and opportunities for discussion, digesting, understanding each other. So again, you've probably been in those management conferences or what have you, and the senior managers will think, I've got to make sure that I give a full and detailed brief on finance, and there's got to be one on sales, and there's got to be one on this. And then they go, but there really needs to be time for them to talk to each other as well. And they'll try and shoehorn something into an already ridiculously busy agenda. It would be much better to have the smaller presentation piece, which feels very broadcasty, and more time for them to have the discussions. So again, it's just setting them up correctly, really. And again, I think that what they do is they go, oh God, right, well, the agenda's got too long. I can just see how the mind goes. The agenda's got too long. Oh my God, that's going to go over 2 days. We're going to have an overnighter. It's going to get really costly. People get too pissed and turn up the following, whatever it might be. And so they often I'm probably speaking for myself here, but then they go, well, maybe we shouldn't have it. Whereas if you don't try and jam so much in, but go, less is more, that you have a smaller agenda, a smaller amount of things, but more frequently. And it doesn't always have to be everyone travelling face to face, but you've got to work out what's right for the culture. But it's not a case of crippling yourself so much that you don't end up doing it. And so then the final one is connecting moments. And we've talked about the 5 coffee challenge. It's informal, but I think that the key thing here that Rich talks about is that don't leave it to chance. Be methodical about who you want your coffee with, why you want your coffee, even to the point of especially if we're in this virtual world, and I might have said this before, my youngest, me going upstairs and finding her online with one of her friends when she was meant to be revising. And of course she was revising, but they're in a world where they're quite happy sitting, looking at each other on a laptop and working together.
Yeah.
So it's all of those different things which could be constituted as having a meeting, but they don't all have to look the same shitty same. And to get that variety back in, I would love to be in organisations doing this all the time, just to say, okay, let me have a look at what your tempo and structure of meetings looks like, and see how we could change it up a notch.
It's really interesting, and that would be, the meeting guru. It would be amazing, but I do think that sometimes that particular connection element is looked down upon, as not so important in terms of we have to have proper strategic meetings, and actually so much of the real work is done in those connections, or those making of connections. Because I just remember I had a boss who he spent very little time in the office. He was always having coffee with people, And I remember a couple of people sort of who were at my level were really a bit sneery about it. Oh, see, he's out of the office again. He's having coffee. And what they didn't realize, but it was very apparent to me, was that he was building the networks that facilitated everything else we did. It was sort of greasing the way for us when we needed favors, or when we to hear what was going on, to understand what opportunities were around. And he would come back and go, oh yeah, this is going on. And we would never have known about it, but for his absolute dedication to making sure that he had his weekly round of the various people he had coffee with to build relationships. And it was a really good lesson for me, actually.
I agree. I think and I've mentioned this before, but the key connecting moment for me was having some element of drop-ins for people to come and see me. And yes, I was on the senior management team, but anyone could come and see me. And there were so many things that I was able to put into the organisation or organisations as a result of talking to all of those different people. So I completely concur. I completely concur with that. And I was then in my meanderings through this wonderful book, Radical Candor, that I also have mentioned before. Kim Scott, the author, talks at some point about having, and I could just thinking, oh my God, this was like me on a daily basis. So you've got a plan in your head about what you're going to get done for the day. And as you walk through the offices, you stop and you talk to somebody because they've just had a baby, or they've just come back from long-term sick, or something is going on in their world. Then you stop and you talk to somebody else, and they're having a problem with somebody else in another department that you have a bit of a chat about. And so before you know it, you're partway through the day and bemoaning the fact that you haven't got any of your work done. And she's talking to somebody who says, I think it's one of her mentors, who says, but that is your work. And I think that leaders often get themselves into, we've got to be this, that and the other, when in fact probably the best thing they can be doing is out having coffee, scanning the external environment, or finding out what's happening, in the culture of their organisations, etc., because it will have an impact on what it is that they're meant to be doing.
Yeah. And on that note, and in the spirit of keeping things efficient and effective and on time, we're going to have to end there, Bobby.
I have got a quote now. I have found one. So, here we go. Meetings should be like salt. A spice sprinkled carefully across a dish, not poured recklessly over every forkful. Too much salt destroys a dish. Too many meetings destroys morale and motivation. Thank you very much, Jason Fried.
Yeah. Perfect. Right then. Well, cheers, Bobby.
Speak
to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. All the resources we mention are on the website and on our Spotify podcast page, so you can read, watch, dig a little deeper at your leisure. Next week, Bridge and I are turning towards a little improv. Really? Isn't that what we've been doing for the last 3 seasons? Okay then, let's just say that we're going to do an improv exercise called Yes and. How much more effective is this than Yes but? Join us for our final episode of Season 3 to hear more about being an advocate for yes and.
And don't forget that if you love the podcast, please vote for us in the British Podcast Awards.